Freedom is often celebrated as the ultimate human achievement, the pinnacle of autonomy that separates us from animals and defines our existence. Yet, paradoxically, it carries a weight so profound that many shrink from it without realizing. In his seminal work, Existential Psychotherapy, Irvin Yalom describes freedom not as a gift that brings effortless happiness, but as a responsibility that can be overwhelming, a silent and persistent presence that presses on the human psyche. Unlike the kind of freedom dictated by external constraints, laws, rules, or societal expectations, existential freedom is the internal recognition that each of us is the author of our own life, and that every choice, every decision, reflects our values, desires, and ultimately our identity. The burden emerges not from a lack of options, but from the realization that the responsibility of choice rests solely upon our shoulders. It is in this vacuum of guidance, where no one else can dictate our path, that the heart of human anguish arises. Yalom illustrates through his clinical cases that the realization of absolute freedom often triggers a profound existential anxiety. Patients come to therapy seeking relief from depression, anxiety, or a vague sense of emptiness, only to discover that their suffering is not rooted in external circumstances, but in the awareness that they alone must shape their lives. This is the paradox of freedom. While it opens the door to potential and possibility, it simultaneously confronts us with the terrifying question of, what if I choose wrong? It is a question that has no definitive answer, no external reassurance, leaving us in a liminal space where indecision and fear flourish. The existentialists, particularly Jean-Paul Sartre, referred to this experience as anguish. And in Being and Nothingness, Sartre writes, "Man is condemned to be free because once thrown into the world, he is responsible for everything he does. This condemnation is not imposed by society or external authority. It is a condition inherent to our consciousness. Every decision we make, whether monumental or mundane, affirms our values and shapes our identity. Skipping a decision, avoiding responsibility, or deferring to others may temporarily ease the pressure, but it does not erase the burden. It merely displaces it, often creating deeper psychological distress. Freud, although not an existentialist, similarly explored how the tension between desire and duty, choice and consequence, shapes the human psyche. Psychoanalysis reveals that many neurotic patterns arise precisely because individuals struggle with the demands of freedom. They seek external structures, rituals, or relationships that relieve them from making authentic choices. Yet even when such frameworks provide temporary comfort, the underlying anxiety persists, waiting to resurface in moments when autonomy is inescapable. Yalom emphasizes that recognizing this dynamic is crucial. The avoidance of choice may feel safe, but it ultimately distances us from living authentically, from fully engaging with the life we could claim as our own. Modern psychology has echoed this ancient insight. Research into decision-making highlights that humans are more prone to stress and regret when faced with excessive freedom. The more options we have, the more we feel responsible for the outcomes, and the more we fear the possibility of choosing poorly. This is not a weakness, it is the natural response of a mind fully aware of its potential and its responsibility. The burden of absolute freedom is precisely this tension between possibility and responsibility, the interplay between what we might achieve and the anxiety that accompanies every path we take. Acknowledging this burden does not lead to despair. It opens the door to understanding the human condition more deeply. To confront the weight of freedom is to recognize that anguish is not a flaw, but a sign of engagement with life. As Yalom observes, those who learn to face their freedom, who confront the anxiety inherent in choice, can begin to live authentically, crafting a life that aligns with their values rather than merely drifting under external pressures. It is a path that requires courage, introspection, and the willingness to accept uncertainty, yet it is also the path toward genuine self-realization. The burden of absolute freedom is heavy, yes, but it is also the portal through which we step into the life we are capable of creating. Anguish is often perceived as a negative force, an unwanted disturbance to the mind and spirit. Yet, within the framework of existential psychology, anguish is far from mere suffering. It is a profound signal, a guidepost pointing toward authenticity. Irvin Yalom, in Existential Psychotherapy, emphasizes that existential anxiety, the deep unease that arises from facing our freedom and mortality, is not a symptom to eradicate, but a compass directing us toward meaningful engagement with life. When we feel the weight of anguish, it is not an accident or a weakness. It is evidence that we are alive, that we recognize the magnitude of our choices and the responsibility inherent in creating our own existence. In the context of existential thought, anguish is intimately tied to freedom. Jean-Paul Sartre described this relationship in his philosophy, asserting that humans are condemned to be free, a condition that inevitably produces anxiety. To live authentically, one must acknowledge that every decision carries consequences, that in every moment we are defining who we are through action. This awareness can provoke discomfort, even terror, yet it is precisely this discomfort that distinguishes an authentic life from one lived in avoidance or conformity. Anguish, in this sense, is a signal that we are confronting the truth of our freedom rather than hiding behind the illusions of certainty or external authority. Yalom illustrates this principle with numerous clinical examples. Patients often arrive burdened with diffuse anxiety, seeking relief without understanding its origin. Through therapy, they begin to recognize that their anguish stems from the confrontation with their freedom, the realization that they cannot defer responsibility entirely to others or to circumstances. One patient described feeling lost in a sea of choices, paralyzed by the knowledge that every decision reflected not just preference, but the shaping of a self. Yalom interprets this anguish as a natural, even necessary byproduct of engaging authentically with existence. Rather than pathologizing it, he encourages exploration, to sit with the discomfort, to examine its roots, and to allow it to guide conscious, deliberate action. Rollo May, another seminal figure in existential psychology, complements this view by framing anxiety as an opportunity. In The Courage to Create, he suggests that experiencing anxiety is evidence of our potential for growth. When we are confronted with the responsibility of freedom, the nervous energy we feel is not a signal of inadequacy, but a call to courage. Avoiding anguish may provide temporary comfort, but it results in a life constrained by fear and conformity, a life where our choices are dictated by avoidance rather than conscious intention. By attending to our anguish, by understanding its message, we learn to navigate the tension between possibility and responsibility, cultivating a life that resonates with our true values. Anguish also reveals the limitations of external validation. In modern society, there is a persistent temptation to seek certainty, guidance, or approval from others. We are encouraged to follow prescribed paths, careers, lifestyles, relationships, without confronting the deeper questions of personal meaning. Yet anguish reminds us that authentic living cannot be delegated. No external standard can replace the inner recognition that we alone are accountable for the direction of our lives. This is why the existentialists regard anguish not as an enemy, but as a teacher. It compels self-examination, pushes us to question assumptions, and demands that we align our actions with our authentic selves. Moreover, acknowledging anguish deepens our connection to time and mortality. Yalom frequently emphasizes the awareness of death as central to existential therapy. Anguish arises because our choices are finite, because our lives are bounded by time, and because every decision shapes the narrative of our existence. Far from being morbid, this awareness sharpens our focus, clarifying priorities and intensifying our appreciation for the present. Anguish becomes not just a signal of freedom, but a lens through which we perceive the urgency and significance of our lives. Ultimately, to embrace anguish is to embrace authenticity. It is to recognize that discomfort is inseparable from growth, that the anxiety of freedom is an invitation to engage fully with life. Yalom's work underscores that by facing our anguish courageously, by examining it rather than suppressing it, we unlock the possibility of self-realization. Anguish ceases to be a burden alone. It becomes a guide pointing toward a life consciously chosen, deeply felt, and profoundly lived. In this sense, the very presence of anguish is evidence that we are on the path to becoming who we are meant to be. At first glance, freedom of choice appears to be a blessing, a hallmark of autonomy that allows us to shape our lives according to our desires and values. Yet existential psychology and modern research reveal a more complicated truth. Too many options can become a source of profound suffering. Irvin Yalom emphasizes that freedom is inseparable from responsibility, and with responsibility comes the weight of potential consequences. The paradox is stark. The very abundance that promises liberation can also provoke anxiety, indecision, and even despair. Barry Schwartz, in his influential work The Paradox of Choice, documents how the proliferation of options in modern life can overwhelm the decision-making process. Individuals confronted with countless possibilities often experience paralysis, unable to act for fear of choosing incorrectly. This modern phenomenon resonates deeply with existential insights. Yalom would argue that this paralysis is not merely a cognitive or emotional response, but a reflection of the fundamental tension inherent in freedom itself. Each choice, no matter how trivial it may seem, carries existential significance because it contributes to the narrative of who we are. The sheer responsibility of sculpting our identity from limitless possibilities can generate a level of anxiety that few are prepared to confront. Existential anguish becomes particularly acute when we consider the moral and personal stakes of our choices. Sartre's notion of existential responsibility highlights that our decisions not only define ourselves, but also serve as implicit models for humanity. Every action carries a shadow of moral implication. To choose one path is to reject another, and each rejection entails its own weight of consequence. The abundance of options magnifies this burden, forcing individuals to confront an almost infinite web of potential outcomes. Yalom observes that this confrontation can lead to deep psychological distress, particularly when individuals fear that their choices may be inadequate, morally wrong, or inauthentic. Modern society amplifies this struggle through social comparison. With access to endless examples of lifestyles, careers, and achievements, individuals may judge their choices against a constantly shifting benchmark. Social media, in particular, creates the illusion that every possible path is visible, attainable, and worthy. Yet this visibility intensifies existential anguish. The awareness that other options exist can foster regret and dissatisfaction with the paths we do choose. Yalom's clinical experience shows that patients often grapple with this what-if anxiety, haunted not just by past decisions, but by imagined alternatives that may have offered greater fulfillment. The paradox is clear. More choices do not guarantee more satisfaction. They often increase the psychological weight of freedom. The paradox of choice also reveals the limitations of avoidance strategies. Many individuals attempt to reduce anxiety by deferring decisions, seeking advice, or conforming to social norms. Yet these strategies rarely resolve the underlying tension. By outsourcing decisions or avoiding them altogether, one may temporarily escape discomfort, but the anxiety persists beneath the surface. Yalom's existential framework suggests that the only path to alleviating this suffering is not avoidance, but engagement, confronting the weight of freedom, embracing responsibility, and making deliberate, conscious choices. It is through active decision-making that one transforms the burden of choice into an opportunity for authentic living. Interestingly, the paradox of choice also underscores the relationship between freedom, meaning, and personal growth. Viktor Frankl, in Man's Search for Meaning, argues that the quest for meaning requires confronting freedom courageously. The challenge of selecting among many options is not merely a logistical or emotional problem, it is a reflection of our struggle to construct a meaningful life. Each choice, though fraught with potential regret, contributes to the formation of a life narrative, a coherent story of who we are and what we value. Anguish, then, is inseparable from the pursuit of meaning. Without it, choices risk being hollow, dictated by convenience or external expectation rather than authentic desire. Ultimately, the paradox of choice teaches that suffering is an inevitable companion of freedom, but it is also a guide toward authenticity. The psychological discomfort associated with making decisions signals engagement with life and the potential for growth. Yalom emphasizes that by confronting the anxiety of choice, reflecting on our values, and embracing the responsibility inherent in freedom, we can transform the burden of options into an instrument of self-realization. Far from being a flaw of modern life, the paradox of choice reflects the fundamental human condition, that the more we are free to define our existence, the more deeply we must confront the consequences of that freedom. Freedom is inseparable from responsibility, and responsibility, in turn, carries the potential for guilt. Irvin Yalom, in Existential psychotherapy, emphasizes that the awareness of one's freedom naturally brings the awareness of accountability. Every choice we make, or fail to make, carries consequences for ourselves and often for others. This awareness can manifest as existential guilt, a subtle yet pervasive psychological force that influences behavior, decision-making, and the sense of self. Unlike moral guilt, which arises from transgressing explicit rules or societal norms, existential guilt emerges from the recognition that we have not fully actualized our potential, that we have compromised authenticity, or that we have avoided embracing the freedom inherent to our existence. It is the invisible cost of choosing, and it is inextricably linked to the human condition. Sartre's philosophy provides a framework for understanding this phenomenon. When he declares that humans are condemned to be free, he's highlighting not only the liberating potential of autonomy, but also its moral weight. Each choice affirms a vision of who we are, and by extension, communicates a model for humanity. To choose one path is simultaneously to reject countless others, and in doing so, we bear the responsibility for those unchosen possibilities. The anxiety and guilt that arise from this recognition are not anomalies, they are essential indicators of engagement with freedom. In therapy, Yalom has repeatedly observed that patients often wrestle with the question, "Am I living as I should?" This question embodies existential guilt, a reflection of the invisible costs of failing to live in alignment with one's authentic self. Existential guilt also reveals itself in the context of relationships. Our choices rarely exist in isolation. They affect others, sometimes profoundly. Yalom illustrates through case studies how individuals experience guilt not merely for actions taken, but for opportunities they did not seize, for kindnesses unoffered, for connections neglected. This relational dimension of responsibility amplifies the weight of freedom. Living authentically requires not only self-alignment, but also an awareness of the ripple effects of our decisions. Even when we strive to act ethically and consciously, the limitations of circumstance and our own human imperfections can give rise to feelings of guilt, reminding us that responsibility is rarely absolute, but always present. Rollo May contributes further insight into this dynamic by framing anxiety and guilt as indicators of potential growth. In The Courage to Create, he argues that the tension between responsibility and limitation is what drives creativity, moral development, and self-actualization. Existential guilt, rather than being a source of paralysis, signals an awareness of the gap between our current actions and our potential. By confronting this guilt, examining its origins, and taking conscious steps toward alignment with personal values, individuals can transform it from a burden into a catalyst for growth. The invisible cost of choosing then becomes a tool for reflection, pushing us to live more intentionally and authentically. Viktor Frankl's work further underscores the interplay between responsibility, choice, and guilt. In Man's Search for Meaning, Frankl emphasizes that the human drive for meaning is inseparable from the responsibility to choose how we respond to circumstances, even those beyond our control. Failure to embrace this responsibility, whether through inaction, avoidance, or compromise of values, can manifest as a deep, existential guilt that permeates one's sense of purpose. Yalom echoes this in his clinical observations. Patients often struggle not only with external pressures, but with the internal recognition that they have not claimed ownership of their lives, that they have allowed fear, habit, or convenience to dictate their path. Understanding responsibility and guilt as inherent aspects of freedom reframes them from sources of shame into guides toward authentic living. Anguish, anxiety, and existential guilt are signals, indicators that we are confronting the weight of choice and the consequences of our actions. By facing these feelings directly, we cultivate moral courage, deepen self-awareness, and strengthen the capacity to act in alignment with our values. Yalom's approach encourages reflection, acceptance, and deliberate action. Acknowledging guilt does not paralyze. It illuminates the areas where we can exercise freedom more consciously and fully. Ultimately, responsibility and guilt are inseparable from the human experience of freedom. They remind us that every choice carries invisible costs, that each path we take inevitably leaves others untraveled. Yet within this tension lies opportunity, the chance to confront our fears, embrace accountability, and transform the weight of freedom into meaningful, deliberate action. As Yalom observes, recognizing and engaging with these invisible costs is a crucial step in living authentically, turning the burden of responsibility into a profound source of personal growth and self-realization. Anguish and anxiety are often perceived as obstacles to a fulfilling life, forces to suppress or escape. Yet existential psychology reframes them as essential catalysts for growth. Irvin Yalom emphasizes in Existential Psychotherapy that confronting the discomfort of existence, its uncertainty, its freedom, its inevitable suffering, is the gateway to authentic living. Courage in this framework is not the absence of fear, but the conscious willingness to act despite it. It is the deliberate engagement with one's freedom, the acknowledgement of responsibility, and the commitment to live in alignment with one's values, even when faced with the weight of existential anguish. The journey from suffering to authenticity begins with awareness. Anguish signals that we are engaging with our freedom, that we recognize the profound consequences of our choices. Rather than viewing this awareness as a threat, Yalom suggests embracing it as a form of guidance. The individual who avoids anguish, who seeks refuge in conformity, external authority, or distraction, may experience temporary comfort, but at the cost of authenticity. True courage emerges when one acknowledges the discomfort, examines the source of existential anxiety, and decides to act deliberately, choosing a path reflective of personal values rather than societal expectation. Rollo May, in The Courage to Create, elaborates on the transformative power of courage. He argues that creativity and growth are rooted in the tension between potential and limitation, between freedom and fear. Anguish, as a signal of this tension, is not a punishment, but an invitation. When we respond with courage, we channel anxiety into purposeful action, transforming existential discomfort into meaningful expression. The act of choosing authentically, despite uncertainty, becomes a declaration of selfhood, a tangible manifestation of one's engagement with life. This is the essence of existential courage, the ability to confront the unknown, to embrace the responsibility of choice, and to accept the inherent risks of living fully. Yalom's clinical observations reinforce this principle. He describes patients who initially experienced paralyzing anxiety when faced with major life decisions. Through therapy, they learned to recognize that the distress was a natural response to freedom and responsibility. By confronting the fear directly, by exploring their values and priorities, they began to make choices that aligned with their authentic selves. The transformation was not instantaneous, nor was it without setbacks, but it highlighted a critical insight. Anguish is not an obstacle to growth. It is the raw material from which authenticity is forged. Viktor Frankl's concept of meaning similarly complements this perspective. In man's search for meaning, he emphasizes that even in the most constrained circumstances, humans retain the freedom to choose their attitude and response. Anguish arises precisely because of this freedom. The responsibility to find meaning in an unpredictable world is daunting, yet it is through embracing this responsibility with courage that individuals discover purpose and resilience. The conscious confrontation with life's uncertainties, the willingness to endure discomfort in pursuit of meaning, transforms existential anxiety into a tool for growth, fostering both psychological and spiritual development. Courage and authenticity are inseparable in this process. Authenticity is not merely a philosophical ideal, it is a practice of aligning thought, emotion, and action. It requires examining our deepest values, confronting fears of failure or judgment, and making choices that reflect our true selves. Yalom notes that patients who cultivate this alignment experience not the absence of anguish, but a new relationship to it. The discomfort becomes tolerable, even illuminating, because it signals engagement with life rather than avoidance. Anguish becomes a companion in the pursuit of authenticity rather than an adversary to be eliminated. Moreover, embracing courage in the face of existential anguish fosters resilience. Each deliberate choice, each act of authenticity strengthens the individual's capacity to navigate uncertainty and complexity. The existentialist view frames life as inherently finite and unpredictable. Courage allows us to respond actively rather than passively, to assert agency in shaping our existence. Yalom emphasizes that this agency is at the heart of psychological well-being. The individual who confronts life's anxieties, accepts responsibility, and acts authentically experiences a profound sense of empowerment, purpose, and meaning. Ultimately, transforming anguish into growth is not a one-time achievement, but a continuous process. The interplay between fear, responsibility, and freedom recurs throughout life, presenting repeated opportunities to exercise courage and deepen authenticity. Yalom's work illustrates that those who learn to navigate this interplay intentionally are not immune to suffering, but they are capable of converting existential challenges into avenues for self-realization. Anguish becomes a signal, courage becomes the vehicle, and authenticity emerges as the destination. A life fully lived, defined not by avoidance of fear, but by conscious engagement with it. The journey through freedom, anguish, responsibility, and courage culminates in a continuous cycle of choice and self-realization. Irvin Yalom emphasizes that existential living is not a linear path, but a dynamic process in which each decision reverberates through the fabric of one's life, shaping identity, values, and purpose. Every choice, every act of engagement with our freedom initiates a chain of consequences that invites reflection, learning, and further action. This cycle of choosing, confronting the consequences, learning from them, and choosing again is the heartbeat of authentic existence, the mechanism through which humans gradually realize their potential. In this cycle, Anguish and responsibility are inseparable companions. Yalom's clinical work demonstrates that individuals who attempt to evade responsibility or suppress existential anxiety often experience stagnation, emotional numbness, or dissatisfaction. Conversely, those who confront these challenges engage in a process of iterative growth. They make a choice, encounter its consequences, reflect on its alignment with their authentic self, and use that insight to inform future decisions. Each iteration strengthens self-awareness and cultivates the capacity to live deliberately. In this sense, existential anguish is not merely discomfort, it is feedback, a signal that one is actively navigating the responsibilities and freedoms of life rather than passively drifting. The philosopher Søren Kierkegaard anticipated this understanding centuries earlier. He posited that human existence is defined by the tension between possibility and limitation. To exist authentically, one must embrace the anxiety that accompanies freedom and use it to guide intentional action. Every choice represents a confrontation with infinite possibilities and finite realities. Each decision excludes countless alternatives, imposing a moral and existential weight that fosters reflection and self-examination. Through this interplay, the individual develops a deeper understanding of personal values and priorities, moving incrementally towards self-realization. Yalom expands on this by emphasizing the relational dimension of the cycle. Choices rarely exist in isolation. They intersect with the lives of others, creating ripple effects that extend beyond the self. As individuals navigate these relational consequences, they cultivate empathy, ethical awareness, and social responsibility. The cycle of choice is therefore not only intrapersonal, but interpersonal, embedding authenticity within the broader context of human connection. By acknowledging the impact of decisions on others, one learns to harmonize personal freedom with moral consideration, creating a more integrated and meaningful life. Viktor Frankl's concept of meaning reinforces the transformative potential of this cycle. In Man's Search for Meaning, Frankl observes that even in the harshest circumstances, humans retain the capacity to choose their attitude and response. These choices, small or monumental, contribute to the construction of a coherent, meaningful life narrative. The cycle of choice and self-realization is thus a continual process of shaping meaning. Each decision carries existential significance, providing opportunities to assert agency, cultivate growth, and refine one's understanding of purpose. The repeated engagement with this cycle strengthens resilience and fosters a sense of mastery over life's inherent uncertainties. Importantly, self-realization is not a fixed endpoint, but an ongoing evolution. The cycle ensures that personal growth remains dynamic. Life's challenges, opportunities, and unforeseen circumstances continually prompt reflection, adjustment, and renewed decision-making. Anguish recurs at each stage, reminding individuals of their freedom and the weight of responsibility. Courage, cultivated through previous experiences, enables them to navigate subsequent cycles with greater clarity and intentionality. Over time, the individual develops a sophisticated capacity to integrate fear, responsibility, and aspiration into coherent, authentic action. Ultimately, the cycle of choice and self-realization embodies the essence of existential living. Freedom generates responsibility. Responsibility evokes anguish. Anguish invites courage, and courage facilitates authentic choice, which in turn generates further self-awareness and growth. Yalom illustrates that embracing this cycle, rather than attempting to escape it, allows individuals to construct lives of purpose, integrity, and profound personal meaning. Each loop of the cycle is an opportunity to refine identity, deepen engagement with existence, and realize the potential inherent in one's freedom. In this way, the human experience of freedom and anguish transforms from a source of fear into a generative process, a continuous journey towards self-realization. Life's weight becomes a medium through which individuals exercise agency, confront their deepest uncertainties, and create a life that reflects their truest selves. The cycle of choice is not merely a philosophical abstraction, it is the rhythm of existence, the mechanism through which we navigate our freedom, confront our anguish, and emerge ever closer to the realization of our authentic potential. If this video resonated with you, take a moment to reflect on the choices shaping your life and the courage it takes to live authentically. Hit like if you found value here, subscribe to join our community exploring the depths of human freedom and meaning, and turn on notifications so you never miss insights that can transform your journey. Share your thoughts in the comments. What choice are you facing today? Your story might inspire someone else to embrace their own freedom and courage. Let's grow together.